Critical controls. So the regulator has embarked on a program of actually conducting their assessments focusing on the critical controls and how those controls are implemented in the workplace. So why are we going down that path? So following an apparent increase in significant incidents, at the same time significant adjustments and change in industry in 2013-2014, the Minister for Resources and Energy, Honorary Anthony Roberts MP, instructed Mine Safety Advisory Council to conduct a review to identify and respond to any systematic and underlying issues contributing to the serious incidents. So it was certainly very political, and we had a number of fatalities and these serious incidents. The Department of Trade and Investment responded by instituting the fatality review, which was undertaken by Noetic. Now that review subsequently made a number of recommendations. So recommendation number one was that MSAC should consider how information on the implementation of risk controls for significant risks could be routinely collected, analysed and used to support a data-led incident prevention strategy. Drawing on the discipline of human factors, including human and organisational factors, expertise, identify the reasons which make it more likely risk controls will be successful and reliably implemented, and consider if the regulator should explicitly focus on critical controls for significant risk as part of the incident prevention strategy. So they were the recommendations out of the fatality review, and subsequently the regulator responded with the incident prevention strategy and pretty much adopted those recommendations as they were. So now, we started new programs, target assessment programs, and proactive programs in the industry a couple of years ago. I think at the same time, it was about that time that we introduced the central assessment unit, so centralised reporting. We have a lot of focus on human and organisational factors. Now in our incident reporting database, we're analysing incidents with respect to human and organisational factors. And we're also adopted our new data systems to actually collect all that incident data. So we're running a program now called ACES2, where all of your incident reports come into our system in a centralised database. All of our assessments, proactive assessments, go into that same database. So we have a centralised database of all the information that we collect. So we can, in fact, start to analyse what's going on in the industry and actually make some decisions based on incident data and the analysis of that data. However, with our assessments, our proactive assessments, we did notice that we weren't collecting data accurately enough to make reasonable assessments. So we've sharpened our pen and we've gone back and we started a program of identifying critical controls for each of the principal mining hazards and looking at ways to carry out those assessments and collect the data in a format that we can actually do real-time analysis and actually get some decent results out of and report back to industry on what our findings are. So we started with the principal mining hazards as prescribed in the legislation, and we then set some priorities for our workshops, our bow tie workshops. Now those priorities essentially are set based on some very coarse risk analysis that was done by the inspectors a couple of years ago now. We all got in a room for each of the sectors and looked at each of the sites across the state, looked at whether or not they had a particular hazard burden, and then looked at exposure. Simple as that. There was no other input that wasn't based on incident data or anything like that. It was purely, do you have the hazard? If you do, how many people are exposed? So that then set our priorities for implementation of our proactive programs. So the next step was bow tie analysis. Now we've had a number of attempts at doing some bow tie work with different organisations. We've started afresh this year. Young Mark McCall come on board with us. He's sitting over here somewhere. And Mark helps facilitate these bow ties. So we're progressively working through the principal mining hazards as our priority dictates, and we're revisiting the bow tie workshops with our own people, our own inspectors. We select a group of inspectors who have some expertise in the particular hazard. We get a mix across each of the sectors, so small mines, coal and medics, and we get them in the room for these workshops and we do the bow tie analysis for the critical controls. We then obviously identify the critical controls, develop our control information summaries, which I'll get to in detail. From that, we then produce our assessment tools. Assessment tools then go into our incident database, our ACES database. We develop a program, which would be, let's say we identified 12 critical controls for a particular hazard, we might develop a program that has 4 critical controls in it this time round, and then in 6 months' time we might go back and do another 4 critical controls in the same principal hazard. So we develop a program that's essentially manageable for the resources we got. The results of that program goes into our database. We can analyse that data, produce a report back to industry on our findings, review the data, and then we go back to the start. It might determine that our priorities are wrong, or we've missed the mark somewhere with our identification of critical controls, and we just go back and do the whole loop again in review. There is another input to that which I'll get to later, which is the incident information that's coming into our database. So the critical controls, we haven't reinvented the wheel here. Many of you would have seen these documents from the ICMM. They're very good documents. That's the model we use, and we're pretty much following it word for word almost. So a critical control, a control that is crucial to preventing the event or mitigating the consequence of the event. The absence or failure of a critical control would significantly increase the risk despite the existence of other controls. So we focus on the critical controls because we'd expect to find, no matter where we are, no matter the industry, coal, metals, small mines, if it's a critical control, you would expect to see it in the workplace managing that risk. It's very important control. So when we develop our assessment tools, we find that when we review them for each of the sectors to make sure they're current, we actually find we're not making many changes at all. A few tweaks of the language, but other than that, if it's a critical control, each of the sectors will have it implemented in their system somewhere. So it's a good test once we've gone back and looked at whether or not we've hit the mark. That review is telling us that we must be pretty close because it's common across the whole industry. So the bow tie analysis. So we get, we set aside 2 days to do a particular hazard. We get a group of inspectors in the room with expertise in that hazard. Keep it nice and neat, 5, 8 inspectors. In the 2 days, we don't expect to finish the whole lot, but what we do want to walk out with is a completed bow tie and identification of the critical controls, and we'll make some inroads into setting the control objectives for each of those critical controls, and I'll talk about that shortly. So it's a fairly onerous task. It's 2 full days. and they're very draining. And then there's homework for those groups of inspectors to go away and finalise the control sheets for each of the critical controls. So prior to that, people don't walk into the room cold. Mark put together a little package for each of the hazards we're going to analyse, previous incidents, learning from disasters, codes of practice, standards, MDGs. People walk into the room to analyse these controls armed with some background knowledge, so we're not starting from scratch, and we're acknowledging work that's been done elsewhere, and we acknowledge previous incidents that actually we have records of in our systems as well. So hopefully we get a good capture of what those controls should be. So those of you who haven't had much work with bow ties, here on the left-hand side, the threats. So we identify the threats, where they might come from. Our incident database is good for that. Preventing controls, the unwanted event, mitigating controls, and the consequences which those mitigating controls are there to try and prevent. The bow tie in working bow tie will not look as neat as that. There might be 20 controls identified. Over the 2 days of analysis and debate and argument at times, we whittle those controls down. Once we get to the control information summary stage, we're actually defining what each of the controls are. We then find we even further combine some of the controls because they've got the same objective anyway. So at the end of the day, I think to date, the most number of critical controls we've had is about eight critical controls. Oh, actually, fire and explosion might have been more, Mark, from memory. But very tightly defined controls, and we spend a lot of time on weeding out duplicates. So the control information summary, this is the most important part of the process, identifying what the objective of the critical control is. If you don't get the control objective right, everything below it is just going to become a mess. Once you fully understand what the control is there to do, you can then determine what the performance requirement is for that control. Once you know what the performance requirement is, and there might be multiple performance requirements, you can then work out what those supporting activities are for that performance requirement. Once you know the supporting activities, then it's a matter of working out, well, when I go out into the field or when I go to the mine, what do I need to look for to tell me that that control is in place? So the final column, the verification method, that's the column that ends up in our assessment tools. So they're the evidence or the questions that the inspectors will ask when they come to site. So generally in our workshops, we'll get the control objective done, the performance requirement, hopefully. But quite often, that's when we'll divvy up the workload. The inspectors will go back to wherever their relevant offices, and then they'll work on finalising the supporting activities and verification methods. We bring that all back to one point, and then we get together as a group, generally a Skype session, and do that sanity check to make sure we've got it right. Once we think we've got it right, we can then develop the assessment tools, and that goes into our database. So the assessment tools we've split into 2 documents. For want of a title, control definition assessment is essentially the desktop audit. And the control implementation assessment is out in the field, actually looking and talking to the workers to see how that control is implemented in the field. It's all good to have this great documented safety management system, but if it's not actually implemented in the field or the workers don't know about it, clearly something's not right. So as you can see, the 2 assessment sheets, we've made them discrete sheets. So we have a sheet for each critical control. So we have a yellow sheet for, so in this case, PC 1.1, preventing control 1.1 is, we have a yellow sheet for that, and we have a yellow sheet for the same critical control for each of the critical controls. So if we had 10 critical controls, we'd have 20 sheets. The reason we've kept them discrete sheets, because when we get to the programming side of it, we might have a principal hazard. The bow tie's identified 10 critical controls. We cannot go to a site and look at 10 critical controls in a day or 2 days. It's just not manageable. So our programs are mix and match. We look at the critical controls that we've identified, and I'll use underground strata as an example. We then looked at which of those critical controls would be in first workings or a development panel. So we might look at 4 critical controls for a development panel. That would then be a program. So it's manageable. We can come on site in a day, go to a development panel, look at those critical controls, and then if we need to, we can come back and do the desktop if we think it's warranted, or those of you in the room may have experienced the target assessment program where we did a desktop and implementation. That program now looks like a yellow sheet and a red sheet together. So a normal inspection is just the red sheet. Hey, well, you've implemented the critical control. A targeted assessment would be the yellow sheet and the red sheet. So our old TAP program now looks like that. So the control definition, as I said, desktop looks at things like the risk assessment, not just looking at the risk assessment, but looking at a particular requirement of the risk assessment. So have you identified a particular thing relating to the principal hazard we're looking at? So we're collecting data that's very tightly defined. We might ask one question about a particular aspect of the risk assessment, but that doesn't mean that that's the end of it. What that question will do, it will open a doorway to other questions. But when we record the results, we're very, very, very tight in what we actually collect from a data point of view so we can actually analyse it. The control implementation assessment, very much binary responses, so it's in place or it's not. We went for a 2x2 matrix. The reason being, our first response is, well, is it there or is it not? And then the next question would be, well, are the workers actually doing it or not? Or if they're not doing it, was it documented and they should have been doing it? Or they're doing it and it's not documented. So quite often we'll go and we'll find workers in a panel, they're all wearing dust masks. Happy days. But they're all wearing dust masks because that's what they used to do when they worked across the road. It's not in the mine safety management system that they need to wear dust masks. So we want to know that. Because if it's not in your safety management system, it's not a written requirement to wear a dust mask. If that crew moves away, or we go to another section where it's a different crew, they may not be wearing dust masks. So we're just clarifying why they're wearing the dust mask. It's actually written in their system and they're following their system, or they're just doing it because that's what they learnt years ago, or that's what they did across the road. So that's why I've introduced the 2x2. You can see the top line there, it's just a binary response, it's either in place or not. Once again, that ties back to collecting data in a very tightly defined way so we can analyse it across the site. So in our database, we set up these program plans. It's a snapshot straight out of the database. As I said earlier, we developed these critical controls and these assessments as discrete tools so we can develop programs in any way we like, mix and match the programs to suit our resources and how sort of the time on site, we can take all that into account. It is something where we're getting a better feel for as we go along, but by having those discrete controls, we can do that mix and match and build program plans to suit. The other advantage of having those discrete assessment tools is if we had an incident somewhere that involved a particular hazard and we thought a particular critical control wasn't in place, we can then use those tools if an inspector went to site to follow up on that and use that as a guide when he's doing his assessment or his investigation of that particular incident. So into our database, each of those line items that were in those assessment sheets ends up in our database. So assessment finding 00203034 CIA 0101 PC 1.1-01, that refers to a particular assessment sheet and a particular question. Once again, collecting the data in a format that we can analyse. So this is the same thing, but this is the results as they've gone in. So we've had inspectors out in the field, they've done an assessment, and they've entered the results of their assessment straight into the database. Straight away we can see we've got a yellow on a particular question. When we plot that onto a dashboard, we can actually see the results across all of the assessments, across all the sites in real time, so as they evolve. So as an inspector goes to sites, puts his results into the ASIS database, we can see it on a dashboard how that program's evolving, and straight away, if we see that yellow bar growing, we can straight away see that we've got a particular issue right across the industry, and we might turn our focus a little bit tighter towards that issue. Might warrant some follow-up, might warrant some reprioritisation. So this is what that dashboard might look like. So here, there's two questions there. You can see the bar graphs building as the assessments go in. So you can see over there on the far right there, we've got 6 yellow responses to a particular question. So, and I think we'll find that is all about telltales, poorly managed in underground coal. Once we collect the results, we can then analyse it. We can analyse it any way we like. We can weight each of the questions, so we can compare risk profiles across site and better inform our risk profiling for each of the sites and the industry. Just ignore those results, they're just made up. So if your mine's up there, it means nothing. So we have, within the resources regulator, we have a group of people who are data analysts, and this is the sort of work they can do. We can tell them which questions are weighted. They can analyse the data, and then that helps us now producing our reports back to industry. It will also help us refine our programs moving forward. So earlier I talked about the incident data actually informing what we do. The numbering scheme that we're using for the critical controls is actually there for a reason. It's mapped right across into our incident reporting database. So if you ring up to report an incident, a person within the CAU can then look at that incident and map it to a critical control. So if you're reporting an underground strata incident, they'll go to the underground strata bow tie critical controls, and they'll map it down to where they suspect that control has failed. So that then will be able to inform us again when we set up our priorities and when we review our bow ties in the future. So it just closes that review loop and helps us inform us when we're setting our priorities for future programs. And that's it from me.